Hello, members. Welcome. Good evening, one and all. My name is Anna from the Tastings and Events team at the Wine Society, and joined this evening behind the scenes by the lovely Mahesh. So hello and good evening, Mahesh. And good evening to you all. I hadn't always thought that we'd be doing a Napa event in the autumn. And I have to say, given today's weather, the blustery winds we've had down here in Essex, there are no three more perfect wines I think I could choose. That was terrible English. But today's weather, I've been craving this tasting for the entire day. It's a bit chilly. I need a bit of warmth. I need a sort of cuddly wine. And these three, I hope, are going to deliver. I know that not everyone will have all of the wines. Some of you may have one or maybe two. But don't worry, we are going to talk, as we always do in these focus on sessions, around the subject of the Napa Valley, and we will use the wines as a tool for the tasting and the talk. But don't worry if you don't have them, we're going to have plenty of fun along the way. As I can see some of you already using the chat, please do remember to select everyone, because otherwise it will just be Mahesh and I that get to see it. So use the chat to let us know where you are, what you're drinking. Maybe you have another Napa Valley or another Californian or American wine this evening. And if you have any questions, pop those in the Q&A. The Q&A is much easier for us to see the questions, but don't worry if you forget. It is just it is just a touch easier for us to be able to manage them. And I'm going to try and answer them as we go along, because Mahesh very kindly feeds them to me on the chat. So thank you, everyone. And without further ado, there is a lot to get through in this very, very famous region. So I'm going to pop, actually, I won't pop the slide up just yet. Let me first start by introducing some basic facts about Napa Valley. So actually, I'll pop the map up, that makes sense. So this is a zoomed in map of Napa Valley, but to give it some context, you'll see down here where it sits in relation to the entire of California. Now, I'm not going to talk too much about the California wine scene or the US wine scene even. We are going to deep dive into Napa today. So you don't need to know much about what's going on in the north and the south. We're just going to look exclusively at this region. But to put it into a sort of global wine context, should we say, it's actually only about 30 miles long. And at parts, particularly in the north, only a few miles wide. So it's not a huge region. And actually, although it accounts for only about 4% of the whole grape harvest of California. So although it's got a huge reputation, it's actually quite a small region. And many people say, oh, it was the first appellation of America. That's not actually true. It was the second AVA, so the American Viticultural Area. It was the second AVA of the states in 1981, after there was a region in Missouri, I think, that was the first. But the Napa Valley was the second, and it was the first in California, and it is arguably the most famous. We'll go on to talk a bit about why it's so famous and why the quality is so good throughout the session. But some nice facts about about Napa wines. I won't go on to grapes too much. I want to talk about grapes in a bit, but the wineries are famous for producing two particular grape varieties, which are Chardonnay and Cabernet Sauvignon, and I will go on to those. They vary because they vary from big conglomerates, and there are some great ones and there are some okay ones. But 95% are actually still family owned. So there is still a family feel, even though the scales, some are large and some are boutique and small. And again, the history of the region really is the reasoning why quite big and quite small wineries can play in the same space here. I will also, well, actually, let's talk about it now. It's quite an incredible part of the world in terms of climate and also geology. So for climate, it's a Mediterranean climate largely, and only about 2% of the world is a Mediterranean climate, would you believe it? But what that tends to do is it does give very good consistency. So if we want to compare it to Bordeaux, first of all, it's about a seventh of the size of Bordeaux, I think. So it's much smaller than Bordeaux. But Bordeaux has, as anyone who was on the Oregon event may have heard me mention, it has a maritime climate. There's a huge amount of influence coming from the sea in Bordeaux. There is a much less prevalent influence of the sea, but it's more controlled here. And I will explain why in much more detail when we go into the AVAs. But just to give you an idea, because I bet some of you are saying, but you're right on the coast. The Atacama mountain range basically runs along here. And because of that, it's actually protected, far more protected than, say, Southern California areas like Santa Barbara, and far more protected than Oregon is from the sea. So it does give it that Mediterranean feel. The reason of that incredible, it is a valley. When people say the valley, Napa Valley is the valley, because you essentially have the Vacas Mountains on the right side, and you have the Mayacamas that I mentioned on the left. And they were created when the San Andreas Fault was being formed. So because of this east and west trapping almost, you get the hot weather stops at the Vaca Mountains, and then you get the cold weather and the wet weather, very importantly, from the Pacific, does stops at the Mayacama. So it's quite well protected, but, and I will go on to this much more in the AVA section. Hopefully you can see my cursor, but when I do the AVAs, I'll make a really big thing of it. In the south, there is a bay, the San Pablo Bay, and I've mentioned it before, but it's just north of San Francisco. And essentially what happens from the San Pablo is the cold Pacific air comes up through the Napa Valley, and that gives it actually quite varied climates. Varied within reason. It's still a Mediterranean climate, but certainly there is some variation. And because of the San Andreas Fault formation, for any geographers, geologists will know, fault lines are often the richest source of different soil types, and things are going up and things are coming down. And here there are actually a huge amount of different soils, and therefore lots of different I'm going to be mean, and I don't mean to be, but variations on a theme when it comes to Cabernet, because you've got Cabernet being grown on lots of different soils, and also different exposures. So north facing, south facing. So those two mountain ranges are going to give you lots and lots and lots of options to play with. So it's rather a cool place. Cool in the sense of groovy, amazing, rather than cool, cold, because anyone who's been will know that it's not a cold place. But I would also say it's not like the Southern Rhone. So let's go on to some history. Not all of these pictures represent exactly what I'm talking about, but I do want to give a bit of a flavour as I talk about it. Napa was actually one of the last parts of California to get into grape growing. Gerv Yount, and I'm not actually sure I've pronounced his first name right, but Mr. Yount, which I believe is where Yountville gets its name. He was actually growing grapes in the 1830s, and there's some evidence of the sort of missionaries growing before then, but it was very small production and the mission grape and not much, if any, vitis vinifera. So the first commercial winery was around 1860, started by a gentleman called Charles Krug, not any relation to the Champagne House. But the region didn't really get going until the 1880s, which in global world standards is a young, youthful area. But they didn't last very long. So even though we have got these lovely wineries pre-1900s, I'm sure many of you will know there were plenty of problems and rough times in the US trade. I'll quickly flick through them if you've not heard of them before, but first of all, they actually had a surplus of grapes, would you believe it, pre-1900. Then they had phylloxera, which is very ironic because it's actually an American louse that got transported to Europe, and it was still living in the American soils, but because they hadn't been growing the vitis vinifera grapes, the European grapes, they'd never had a problem. All of their vitis ripari and lambrusco, all of those species had grown up with the louse and not a problem. When they started growing vitis vinifera grapes, so things like Chardonnay, Cabernet, Zinfandel, suddenly the louse was a problem. So phylloxera wiped out around 80% of the vineyards. Then 20s, we have Prohibition. Most wineries were abandoned, but I will say that there were a few who bent the rules, found loopholes, kept the place going. And then in the 1930s, I think it was 33, correct me if I'm wrong, when Prohibition was ceased, there were a few producers that, so the likes of Inglenook, who are very famous, were then resurrected. And they'd sort of been plugging away in the background. But the Mondavi family bought the Charles Krug winery. There's a few others that kind of come to fruition in the 30s. But there is no doubt that the 30s were tough for California and Napa. And actually, a lot of people were going for bulk from about the 30s to the 60s. So I think Jancis Robinson describes the producers of that era as kind of like guardians almost, and they just kept things going. During that time, there was an emergence of big companies. So I've mentioned two of them already. So the Charles Krug winery, Inglenook was another one, and I've already mentioned, but things like Louis Martini as well, which still exists today. So big companies specializing in fine wine were being formed. But then there were also some smaller boutique wineries. So Stony Hill is a very famous one. We still sell a lot of their wines. Mayacamas, which is the same name as the mountain range. We actually sell them as well from time to time. So there were these two sort of schools of production occurring at the same time. The small guys, the boutiques that were just setting up, it was a brave new world of wine production post-Prohibition. And then there were also these big companies who had maybe been around a bit before and were just getting back into gear, but had lots of estate, as in land and all this sort of thing. But then the next big thing, I'm mentioning this now rather than a bit to more of an extent than in my California, because the 1967 Paris tasting organized by Steven Spurrier changed the wine scene in Napa forever. And there's an argument that it changed the world. So for those who don't know, I'll be quick, but essentially Steven Spurrier, English gentleman who was working in France, owning a wine merchant in Paris, he didn't believe that people would be able to say that the American wines that were coming through were better than the French. And so he said, well, let's put this to the test, because nobody has done a blind tasting of Napa versus France. So it was sort of Bordeaux and Burgundy versus Chardonnay and Cabernet from Napa. 11 judges, one was British, him, one was American, and 9 French judges. And I thought I'd share with you the results in this session, because little did he know that actually everybody always says, oh, America won. They did to an extent, but I want to make it clear it was a fairer fight. They did get placed first. So the most famous win was of the Reds. So the Stag's Leap Wine Cellars Cabernet from 1973 won first place. And behind it in second, third and fourth were Mouton Rothschild, Haut-Brion and Montrose, who all the 1970 vintage. And then Ridge Montebello was fifth from 1971. So safe to say Stag's Leap went up in value quite a bit during that tasting. And then the white wines. And if anybody's ever seen Bottle Shock, they focus on Chateau Montelena in that film. It's about Steven Spurrier's journey and how this tasting came about. But Chateau Montelena won first. And then again, it goes French, American, French, American, American, French. So you have, again, it's quite fair. Out of the 10 that were placed, actually, I think there's a longer list than that, but out of the top 10, technically, it was half and half. But the winning wines were 2 American, or more specifically, Napa wines. So, of course, what does that mean? Well, that means that in the 70s and 80s, you go from 20 wineries to 200. So there are still those big companies, but there are also smaller companies being inspired by the sort of Stag's Leap model, and Chateau Montelena, which actually was a small winery as well. So let's try what I would describe as one of those big quality producers in our first wine. So we're going to go for wine number 1. I'll just check that Mahesh hasn't. Okay, so we've got a grape variety question, which I'll speak about in a minute. So we'll get to that when I talk about grape varieties, but nothing just yet. Good. If anyone hasn't seen the film Bottle Shock, by the way, I strongly recommend it. It's beautifully light viewing. Alan Rickman plays Steven Spurrier, who also founded the Académie de Vin and was, sadly, he passed away last year. He was an icon in wine, and if you haven't seen it, it's a wonderful ode to him. He actually went on to repeat the Judgement of Paris, as it got called, and America won both again. But he there's a lovely line in the film that's something like, "This is going to change the way the world views wine," and actually it did. And he went on to be a big advocate for wines all around the world. So yeah, his French-leaning tendencies were very European at the time, and it did change the way we think about wine. So Napa is always, forever and ever, going to be seen as pioneers of non-European fine wine production. So this is the First Press Napa Chardonnay. Now, First Press is actually a sub-brand or an owned brand of the Delicato family wines. And I think, again, that European feeling of going, oh, it's owned by somebody else. It's owned by, you know, a big group. That's just not the case in Napa. I mentioned earlier, those big groups were often the people that bought those who went bankrupt during the Prohibition and helped them, and big investment companies, big money. It can go wrong. There's plenty of times it does, but Delicato have actually been named American Wine Producer of the Year more than any other company. So 3 times at the International Wine and Spirits Competition. So the family group, the owners, Delicato. First Press is their how would I describe it? It's a really good traditional nod. I think Sarah says that, traditional. So there are a lot of Californian Chardonnays from the cooler areas that I'll show you in a minute that are trying to do something else, be that European or whatever you might think, but this is definitely, in all senses of the word, a kind of what you think of when you think of top quality Napa Chardonnay. So very traditional, very rich. They've picked cold and warm sites. Now, why do I say that? Well, the cooler sites mean that they can get the acidity, so they still have freshness, but those warmer sites are much richer, so you start to get those honeydew notes, the really intense bordering on tropical fruits. It's also those sorts of really strong flavors that mean that you can age it in oak. So the concentration means that it's had French and American oak, so you'll get like a lovely vanilla note. Hopefully, I get lots of lemon meringue pie, but without it being sweet and sickly. And that's where those cooler climate grapes come in. To be able to blend cooler and warmer sites is a beautiful thing. But that is why it's also a Napa Valley Chardonnay. So the big AVA, it means they've blended different regions together. I will also say it's had malolactic fermentation or conversion, meaning it's slightly more on the yogurty rather than green apple aromas, and then it's been aged on the lees, so the dead yeast cells, and with batonnage. I think from memory it's twice a month that this was batonnaged, which will mean it gives that yeasty, slightly I always get on really good quality Chardonnay like this, touch of rye bread or kind of salty bread. I always think of rye bread as salty. I'm not quite sure if it is, because ironically I don't think rye bread's got much yeast in it. I could be wrong, but it's that salinity for me. Ken and Andrea said very good value for £17. I mean, that is kind of the point of fine wines from Napa. An under £20 very fine Chardonnay from Napa is a great thing, but perhaps it wouldn't be as affordable had it not been owned by Delicato. So I'm going to have a taste. Hopefully all that lees aging, that malolactic, that oak, it's going to be really lovely and textural and sort of creamy and dense. So I'm going to give it a go. Immediately I was hit by this beautiful kind of like sweet lemon, preserved lemon with, oh yeah, and it's got a lovely acidity. My eyes are watering. It's got great acidity, but it's sort of preserved lemon, bit of vanilla, bit of tropical, that salty finish, which I think is great. And it's a real foodie wine. So here for me, these kinds of Chardonnays, I want to be looking at my big, rich, creamy fish pies. You may notice I've actually coravanned the red wines tonight, but I've got cobwebs on it. I've coravanned the reds tonight. I can save them. But I've opened the Chardonnay because I'm having homemade fish cakes, and that's the sort of thing this goes with, that kind of rich, indulgent, anything with a touch of nutmeg, I always say is great for these. So I put nutmeg on my fish pie, but anything with nutmeg in it, full stop. Anything with some nuts, like hazelnuts, so chicken and stuffing would be delicious. Or if you are vegetarian, then anything nutty, full stop. So a big mushroom risotto with plenty of butter, and yeah, maybe a bit of hazelnuts on those. I had a beautiful mushroom pasta recently with hazelnuts on the top, and I really, really, really wish I'd had that wine to hand. So it's kind of a complex wine, but equally it's just pleasure. It makes me smile. And I think that's the nice thing about these kind of wines. They are very high quality, but you don't have to think about them to the extent that they're not too pensive. You can just enjoy them, which I think is gorgeous. I'd love to know what other people think. Yeah, very good for 17 from Ken and Andrea. Great. I think for me, if I was going to compare it to other Napa Chardonnays, it's probably like friendlier and cuddlier, and it hasn't got necessarily the most perfect fruit definition. But if you're going to be looking for good quality Napa Chardonnays in the UK, sadly, you're going to be probably spending about £40 to get that really, really premium level. So this is, for me, perfect, good quality, like good underlined 3 times Chardonnay, with a sort of smiley face next to it. And yes, this quality would be available in other parts of the world more affordably. There's no doubt about that. But I think the winemaking here is so good. And you just, yeah, it makes you so happy. And I don't think you'd get I've nenever tasted a Napa Chardonnay with quite that quality at that price. So well done, Sarah Knowles, our buyer, is what I say. Ken and Andrea, who've got it, said it went very well with their dinner last night. Lime marmalade chicken. Gosh, that sounds amazing. Yeah, I bet it did. And that marmalade sweetness as well. There is a bit of sweetness here. It's dry, there's no sugar in it, but it has got that lovely sweetness to it. So we've spoken about Chardonnay, which is the how do I want to describe this? I was about to say, yeah, the queen. If the king is Cabernet, Chardonnay is the queen. It's the second most planted grape variety in the whole of Napa. We've seen that you can put a lot of winemaking techniques there. So barrel fermentation, lees stirring, MLF, we've had all of those, barrel aging. And this is the style that was particularly popular during those 60s, 70s and further on. And it still is very popular. It's kind of a classic Napa style. However, there are movements I mentioned. So when we go on to AVAs, you'll spot there's an AVA really far south called Caneros. And they have really high calcium soils and a cool climate, genuinely cool climate. And so you're actually moving towards more of, I don't want to say Chablis because it's got a lot more sunshine in it than Chablis, and the fruit is richer, I would say, and it's less kind of like streamlined, elegant than a Chablis. But you're definitely going to be making some of those more cool climate Chardonnays from places like that. So there is no one size fits all for Chardonnay, and I want to put that out there first. But let's talk about some other varieties. So we have Napa Cabernet. So Napa Cabernet is the most planted grape variety. It's about just under half, so it's like 40% and 45% of total production by volume, but way over that in value. So it over indexes hugely on the value of the wines produced versus volume. I've mentioned already you can get a huge variety of expressions depending on where it's grown. So that might be because you've got a different soil, you've got all sorts of volcanic, sedimentary, you name it, it's here. And one of the major things when we talk about AVAs, I'll go into this more, but what they sort of tried to do to emulate Bordeaux by making sort of communes, so AVAs within the Napa AVA. And the growing temperatures and elevation and aspect make a huge difference as well. So we'll go on to that when I talk about those. But generally, if you were looking for a Napa Cabernet versus the rest of the world, what would I be looking for? They're often quite dense, very powerful, often quite high in tannins. And that's not just because of the sunshine. It can actually be because of the cooler climates and the longer growing season, but with high sunshine. Because Cabernet has thick skins, and because of those long sunshine hours, they will tend to produce, the grape skins will thicken almost as a protection to the pips of the grape. And the other thing that the sun will bring along with those high tannins are higher alcohol levels. They are often slightly spicy because of the oak. There are more and more producers using dominating French oak rather than American, but traditionally it's been a blend, and there are majority of people still do a blend, and some are still using full American, and the really spicy notes tend to come from the full American oak. It is long aged. That's the other thing I'd say. These wines last a long time, and hence why Steven Spurrier tried to do another one 30 years later. He wanted to see whether the wine's aged, and they do. I've only got one problem with the Cabernets, and we're going to go on to Cabernet in a minute. So before we do that, I'll talk about the other varieties. But I do have a small problem with the Cabernet in Napa, in the sense that Napa made Cabernet so famous, and because we didn't ever order a Cabernet Sauvignon until Napa made it famous. And because of that, a lot of people have planted Cabernet where maybe they shouldn't, or could do something better, because it is so popular. So there are a few people who stick to their guns, and people like Frog's Leap who produce amazing Zinfandel, and you say good on you. And certainly our next wine is not an ode to Napa Cab, but there have been huge discussions as well that I find fascinating about how actually this monoculture and this desperation to have the best Cabernet Sauvignon in the world might be the undoing of Napa, because it's not a great variety that will deal with the increasing temperatures. So climate change will affect it significantly, and actually to have put all their eggs in one basket in many senses is a dangerous game to play. So I suspect over the next 5, 10, 15 years, we're going to see more and more producers experimenting with things like our next wine, which is a blend of different varieties, but also trying to focus on other great varieties. Zinfandel in particular is very good. So, hey, let's talk about those grapes, shall we? Rather than me being a moan, there are still places where Cabernet will be amazing. We'll never lose Cabernet, and they'll just have to like they've done with Sauvignon Blanc in New Zealand, for example. New Zealand's slightly less affected, they think, by climate change, but Sauvignon Blanc in New Zealand is arguably the only other place in the world where there is this desperate monoculture of one variety in Marlborough. But they've changed the way they trellis the vines and all sorts of things to mitigate changes over time. So I think that's also going on in Napa. Second red grape of importance is Pinot Noir. It's been around since the 70s. Sorry, Merlot. Merlot is probably the next. Pinot Noir is probably the third red. Merlot is really popular because it's a blend with Cabernet to make a Bordeaux blend. But actually, I think I spotted somebody's drinking a Duckhorn tonight. There are fantastic Merlot producers. So Duckhorn is one of them. And if you've never tried a Duckhorn wine, they're great. The quality of Merlot in Napa Valley is fantastic. Now, the alcohols can get quite high again, but they are quite different to the Merlot of Bordeaux on the right bank. So if you're a right bank drinker, don't expect it to taste like your Saint-Emilion or your Pomerol. In fact, 2 members have got Duckhorn. Brilliant. Tell me if I'm not tasting a Duckhorn right now, but from memory, Duckhorn is kind of more expressive fruits, very soft and supple and juicy, but it's got a lot more black fruits, so black plum, black cherry, than say your Pomerol would. And particularly, they tend not to blend it with Cabernet Franc as they do in Bordeaux. It's a real standalone grape variety. We've got, I mentioned Pinot Noir. So Caneros, again, Los Caneros, that southern point where it's cooler, is very, very good. Again, long season, can keep the high acid, doesn't over ripen the fruit. If you start to go too far north, we'll explain it in a minute, but Pinot Noir is a disaster up north in Napa. So a lot of sites are far too warm. Pinot tends to be better from Sonoma and then places like Santa Barbara, but Los Caneros is really the place. If you're buying a Napa wine, that's where you want to be buying it from if it's a Pinot Noir. There is quite a bit of Sauvignon Blanc, which is, they do some unoaked versions, but the oaked versions they tend to call Sauvignon Fumé or Fumé Blanc. Fumé Blanc's more common. And they ferment and age it in oak. It's fascinating. They're actually often quite expensive wines. If you've never tried a Fumé Blanc style, give it a go. It's not my personal cup of tea, but actually I really enjoy it when it comes up because it's just so different and so unusual. But yes, the unoaked fresh versions of Sauvignon are coming from the mountain vineyards that I'll show you in a sec. Zinfandel, I've mentioned already. There are loads of old vines in Napa and they make the most incredible wines. So really intense, plummy, spicy, juicy wines, often quite high alcohol. I will give them that. But I mentioned already Frog's Leap. If you've not tried an old vine Zinfandel of top tier quality, get your hands on a Frog's Leap because they are incredible wines. And they don't really make white Zin here, so they don't make that pink blush. Why would you? You can only charge, let's say, maximum £10 for a bottom of the shelf white Zinfandel, and if you've got the soils of Napa, you're going to be making a massive loss because you could be making unbelievable Zinfandel or other grape varieties in their place that would sell for 3, 4, 5 times the price. So nobody's really making white Zin. If you come across a Napa white Zin, please please tell me what it is. I want to try it. And then lastly, let's talk about the sort of, somebody asked me about Viognier. There is not much Viognier being produced. No, is the answer. And I don't really know why. I'm trying to think if I've ever had a full Viognier from Napa. I don't think I have. It might appear in a field blend. So the one we've got next is a not real field blend. So they were very popular in the olden days. And now, instead of planting loads of grape varieties together and chucking them all in the ferment, instead they sort of make styles that are a blend of complementary grape varieties, but they do tend to vinify them separately. So that's what we're having here. And I'll quickly run through. In fact, I probably could. Actually, it's only Petit Syrah that I've not spoken about. So Petit Verdot and Malbec are both grown. They usually go into the Bordeaux blends, as does Cabernet Franc. So they don't make Cabernet Franc in the style of the Loire. What I would say is Cabernet Franc 100% is actually really, really delicious from Napa. It's quite rare, but the producers that are planting Cabernet Franc are finding that it's doing quite well. And then Syrah is planted. It's not the red fruited Northern Rhone. I know that there's still quite a lot of black fruit styles in the Northern Rhone, but there's definitely a lot more sunshine going on here. It's quite big, black, juicy. It's more almost a Zinfandel style of Syrah. And then we have Petit Syrah, which is not the same as Syrah and is actually in this wine. It's actually Durif. The berries are a bit smaller, but it's very thick-skinned. If you can imagine, the skin to pulp ratio is almost the opposite of Syrah. So the berries are smaller, but the skins are very thick. So you get these big, inky, almost chewy tannins of full Petit Syrah, which is quite popular, but it needs a lot of oak. And then it goes into this incredible dark chocolate, coffee amazingness. So on that note, let's talk about our next wine because it has some Petit Syrah in it. So our next wine is from Brown Estates and it's called Chaos Theory. And I quite like that it's called Chaos Theory. I haven't done the research onto why it's called that. I just made the huge assumption that it's because it's a pretty wild mix of grape varieties in the best possible way. So it is, and I'm going to try and remember this, but if not, I hope it's, actually, I haven't got it written down. I was going to say, I think it's 35. If anyone's got the bottle of this as well, it looks chaos, but that's kind of why I like it. It's 14.5%, not surprising given the grape variety list I'm about to read to you. So it's 35% Merlot, 35% Petit Syrah, 15 Cabernet, and 15 Zinfandel. So already in that list, we have some 4 powerhouse grape varieties. We've got a lot of black fruit. So Merlot is the only one, and Zinfandel arguably, that's going to give you a lot more red fruit. But Zin, Petit Syrah, and Cabernet Sauvignon are also all three quite high tannin varieties. So I mentioned earlier about Petit Syrah giving me this dark chocolate and coffee, and you'll see here there's this mocha note that Sarah's picked up. Now that will, amongst other things, be coming from the oak, but Petit Syrah for me brings that lovely mocha when it does have the oak. So this saw 12 months in oak, and it was half and half French and American, and of that a third was new. So we have had a big lashing in a good way of some new oak. For me, I get this in Zinfandel, and I get it on Petit Syrah from Napa as well. It smells, I don't know if anyone's tasting it this evening. It smells, I know that Mahesh has got a bottle. It smells of Black Forest Gatto. And let me explain that in the nicest possible way, because it's not a sweet wine, don't get me wrong, there's nothing sweet about this. When you taste it, it's dry, it's got a tiny touch of residual sugar, as a lot of the wines in Napa do, but it's dark, intense cocoa, sorry, getting my words out there. So it's this dark, intense cocoa that you get sort of sprinkled on the top, and then you have this sweet chocolate in there too. And I know you're going to say, what are you talking about, dark and, you know, cocoa and sweet chocolate? But it does have a distinction for me. One is bordering on that savory, you know, almost spicy dark thing, and one is this really sweet vanilla-esque creamier smell of milky chocolate. So it is an amazingly complex nose. And then the colour's gorgeous. We shouldn't judge wine by looks necessarily, but the colour is gorgeous. It's got this lovely purpley hue, but slightly browned from that oak aging as well. I'm going to have a taste. A lot of tannins going on here. Serious tannins, as we were to expect. This is ready to drink now, but it's ready to drink now with a steak. It is it's ready to drink with a steak or a burger or something. Actually, burger would be great, because I think that like a melted cheeseburger would be amazing. But it is powerful. It's almost like everything, the sum of its parts came together and just made it extra strong. It's very well integrated. So what I would say is I'm getting a lovely, refreshing finish. So I'm not feeling like I'm overwhelmed. The initial hit is overwhelmed, but my mouth is now watering and I feel the freshness. I get a bit of black pepper. Petit Syrah can do that sometimes, and Zinfandel sometimes. I'm getting black pepper up my nose. And yeah, that black pepper along with that fruit and that chocolate cocoa, there is a lot going on. I think somebody said that chaos theory was high fashion in my area of mathematical physics some time back. I didn't spot the wine connection, if there was one. I don't think there is one. I think it's that, for me, the chaos theory is that there is so much going on, but what's really, really clever about this wine is no one thing sings higher than the rest. It's almost like a group of really, really good musicians all giving it a go. Jazz musicians, I would say, where they jazz musicians who are all very good in their own right, and they're playing in unison very well, rather than one having a moment. It feels like everything's really well combined. It's quite hard to do that when you've got such big characters and big personalities in your grape varieties. It looks like somebody's double decanted it and their tannins have softened. If you've got this bottle and you think, oh my goodness, because I did spot somebody think so it wasn't for them. If it's too overpowering, can I suggest you taste it again tomorrow? That would be my strong recommendation. I haven't opened my bottle, but I might actually leave my glass as well for tomorrow. Double decanting will speed things up. Taste it tomorrow, see what you think, and also try it with anything high protein and high salt. So cheese is great, meat is great. Food-wise, if you're a vegetarian for this, I think you need to go really big. So I'd go for like a beetroot, lentil, parmesan, red lentil, you need a lot of flavors going on. Or actually just a piece of Parmesan cheese, so long as it's not animal rennet Parmesan. I like that somebody said a hand cream aroma. I think that's very true. I think there is something floral and perfumed. You can get that from a few of those grape varieties, actually. So Cabernet can be violets. It could be that. And Petit Syrah sometimes does as well. And Zinfandel. In fact, they all actually can sometimes have a slightly floral note to them. But there's a lot going on. Peter Cousins put his through the Coravan aerator, and it's delicious. I'm jealous of the aerator. I'm going to swirl mine around a bit later and see what happens. But I love it. But it's kind of, yeah, Chaos Theory is the perfect name for that wine. I think it's wonderful. So let's talk, last but not leastly, before we go on to our final wine, about the different AVAs, because personally, I think that's probably one of the most interesting things about Napa. You can see here that they've definitely been divided up by geography. To some extent, some are better defined in geography than others. There's a bit of an argument that American AVAs are often just done by lines of boundaries of farms and things. Napa is sometimes a little like that, but actually largely they've done quite a good job. Because of the nature of this long, thin valley, they have tried in some ways to make it quite similar to the left bank of Bordeaux, like I mentioned, and I think largely it works. I think there are clear differences in terms of temperature. I don't think the soil differences have been quite so clearly defined. So I'm going to focus on the temperature differences, because within each, there are several different soils that will make it really hard for me to go through everything. We could be here all night. What I will do is send you a crib sheet that I've got for the follow-up email tomorrow, and I've got a crib sheet that's largely ripped from, I think I ripped it from Napa Valley vintners, but it will tell you, if you're really interested, which soils are found within which regions. And it's not an extensive list, but it gives you a good overview. But the soils become really, really hard to dig into because it's not quite the same in every place. But temperature and aspect and altitude are really well defined. So I've already mentioned we've got the Vaca range here, and then we've got the Mayakama Mountains on the left side, the west side. And I've also mentioned about this San Pablo Bay bringing through that wind tunnel of cool air. And I think thinking about it like that is the best way to consider the AVAs. So firstly, it's not logical, because in a logic person's brain, they'd say, right, well, the further away you are from the equator, the cooler your vineyards. And actually the opposite is true here. The further you are away from San Pablo Bay, is the warmer your vineyards. So it's actually flipped on its head. So the more northerly are actually the warmer, and the more southerly are actually the cooler. The second distinction is that this middle section here is the valley floor, and there are 9 of those AVAs, and the mountain AVAs, as they're called, of which there are 6, are different. So we're going to think about the valley. I'll talk you through the valley floor first, and we'll probably go south to north because that makes the most sense. So we'll talk about the valley floor first, and then we'll talk about the mountains. And then there is a really odd one, Wild Horse Valley AVA, which overlaps with, so we're in Napa now, and it overlaps with Solano. Now, Wild Horse Valley is quite sad. You might just see it down here. I'm hoping you can see my cursor. Please shout if you can't. But Wild Horse Valley down here in the southeast gets a lot of sun. It's cool climate, so it's actually a good spot for Pinot Noir, because the San Pablo's here. You can see it at the bottom of this picture. So it is a cool spot. There's a bit of elevation, but sadly the Wild Horse Valley, the biggest winery, which was Wild Horse Valley Winery, actually was destroyed in recent wildfires. So they're sort of rebuilding Wild Horse Valley as a region, but only half of it. If anyone's on my Oregon, one thing that they are quite good at in America is they won't just say, because the state stops here, that's the end of this. So this is a shared AVA. It overlaps with Solano. So let's talk about the big ones. Well, they're all big in their own right, and in fact they're actually quite similar sizes, which is quite unusual. but they're not similar shapes. That's what's important. But let's go from the southernmost, and then we're going to taste. Let's go through the southernmost, and then we'll taste, and then we'll do let's do the valley, and then we'll do a little tasting, and then we'll do the mountains, because the final wine is actually a mixture of valley and mountain. So that's why I wanted to do it that way. So starting at the southernmost, we've got Los Caneros. I've mentioned it a couple of times already today, but that really is hit by the cool winds from San Pablo Bay. So we are talking Pinot Noir, we're talking Chardonnay. We have some Cabernet as well, but Pinot Noir and Chardonnay, cool climate. And then, of course, where you grow those two grapes in a cool climate, you also make very good sparkling wine. So Los Caneros, it's also shared with Sonoma, I already mentioned earlier. So one of the rules with the AVA system in Napa is that if it's Los Caneros on the label, but it's from Napa, you have to put that it's the Napa part. Unless, of course, you're blending Los Caneros from both states. Not states, sorry, what am I saying? Regions. Whilst we're on that point, I'll just mention anywhere within this entire region is the AVA for the entire of Napa Valley. So if it's coming from somewhere, or if you're blending a few like these ones, first two were, then in fact all three are, then you just call it Napa. James has mentioned that James has just said there's no mention of the famous Paris standoff. James, it was right at the beginning, so if you joined us late, then feel free to rewatch. We've done it already, but I will mention Stag's Leap in a minute. I'll point the beginning. So we've done Caneros. We then go through the city of Napa, which is quite interesting. And if you haven't been, I haven't been, I'm desperate to go. There are masses of really great places to visit to drink wine. Believe me, I've done my research. We then have to the side of the city of Napa, to the east side, we have Coombsville. Coolish, so quite cool, not as much impact as Caneros. And Merlot is really popular here and does really well. So if you see a Coombsville Merlot, get it. It's great. Then we've got the Knoll District moving north of the city of Napa. This is great for Zin and Merlot. And again, coolish. So not as cool as Los Caneros, but still cool climate. And you're making there these kind of more refined Zin and Merlot styles, in the sense that they're a little bit less fruity. Perhaps they're less concentrated, though. There's an argument to that. And you're actually making them on the more red and floral style than you are on those big berry styles. Yountville here, or Yountville, depending on your accent, which is just to the, God, my north, south, east, and west, terrible today, west of Stag's Leap, which is very famous. Yountville's a bit of a mixed bag. There is some good sparkling wine there. You may remember that I mentioned one of the original founders was sort of based here, and it's named after him. But I would say quite a mixed bag here, and it's not really made a name for itself per se, unlike its next door neighbour, Stag Leap. Now, this is, I'm going to say something really stupid here, the warmest of the cool sites. So it's still on the valley floor, but it is right up against the Vaca Mountains. So if you can see that, I will send these round, but you can see the Vaca Mountain range is really right up against Stag's Leap here. So you start to get into what's called benches. And benches are sort of long strips of land that sit on the bench of the mountainside. So Stag's Leap starting to make these benches, or has been pioneering these bench sites. And it's where, obviously, the famous Stag's Leap winery winning wine was. So surprise, surprise, considering it was a battle against Bordeaux, they specialise in Merlot and Cabernet blends here. In particular Cabernet, but I would say the blends are probably the way forward. It will allow for those climate change moments. We then move York into Oakville, and Oakville is one of the most famous. So it's where the cool finishes, is the best way I can describe it. We start to get warmer now. The influence stops at Oakville, but Oakville's probably got some of the most famous wineries in the entire world in it. So Opus One, Screaming Eagle, the sorts of wineries that do not allow visitors because it is so top secret. Believe me, there are fellow MW students and I have long conversations about how they make Screaming Eagle, because nobody knows. because it's closed to the public and closed to anyone. So this is prime real estate. We talk about it being expensive to produce wine in Napa. It is eye-watering to produce wine in Oakville because the land is so expensive. So north of Oakville, we start to get warmer. And again, a lot of these places we talk here, Oakville and Rutherford, you notice that they're hugging on the Vaca range as well. We're going to be talking about benches here again, particularly as we start to get warmer into Rutherford. We want those bench sites. The lower, and we will do more and more so in the future with increased temperatures. So Rutherford is really amazing Cabernet. So Inglenook is here, one of the most famous. Lots of the old school originals are around here. And our final wine, this will be a nice segue in just a moment because I've only got 2 more to do. Our final wine has got grapes from Rutherford, and it really is one of the 2 heartlands, arguably, of Cabernet. So Santa Lena and Rutherford and Oakville are probably the 2 most famous. But we'll quickly cover Santa Lena. Santa Lena's got the narrowest valley section. There is zero influence really of the San Pablo Bay here. But there's loads of historical, very good winemaking. So Charles Krug, who was not related to the Krug Champagne, but a pioneer for the region, he set up his stable here, as it were, in the 1860s. So it's a beautiful old area and some amazing vineyards as well. I think, am I right in thinking? Yeah. I think Ridge has got really, I can't remember the name of their vineyard in Santa Lena. And then finally, Calistoga, which is quite an old area, and it only became an AVA about 10 years ago, even though it's one of the originals. And this is where Chateau Montelena, the winning white wine, is from. Interestingly, to think, oh, well, why on earth is the Chardonnay from one of the warmest places? Because you said it got warm as you go up. It does still get warm, but actually there is a little bit of ocean influence here. But it's mainly about the fact there's some altitude, and also there's you can basically get warm nights, the opposite, warm days and cold nights in Calistoga, which means that the Chardonnay does get a little break during the night, so it's not hot jammy. So let's taste, and then I'll tell you about the mountain vineyards, because I know that everyone wants to get onto the Longmeadow Ranch, so I'll skip through to that, and then so this is Longmeadow Ranch, pretty unassuming place, I'd say. Actually, it's a lovely wedding venue, if anybody's interested, but it's a beautiful sort of old farm style. They make this Napa is from the Rutherford vineyards that I've mentioned, and then the mountain vineyards in the Mayacamas. So that's why it's a really nice wine to talk about AVAs, because what they're doing here is very similar to what I talked about with the first press Chardonnay. They've got the Rutherford that's got that warmer expression of fruit, but it's going to get the perfect amount of ripeness on the skins. It's going to get that really black, intense flavor that we hope for when we've got our Cabernets from Napa. But then cleverly, the Mayakama mountain sites are going to be cooler climate. So they're going to have a really long growing season. They develop really nice phenolic ripeness, but they also can retain some of the acidity. So by blending the 2 regions and just calling it Napa Valley rather than focusing on an AVA, they've got the best of both worlds. That is not to say that a nested AVA like a straight Rutherford is worse. By all means, the sites in those single AVA wines are incredible. And we do have lots on the website that I'll send you links to, so you can check out the different stages of temperatures and warmth, etc. But I think for this wine, this is a really, really clever idea to blend the 2 sites. So even though it's 100% Cabernet and it's grown in what is arguably a warm place, it's only 13.5% alcohol. And that will come from those mountain sites being blended in. The alcohol won't be as high on those as the Rutherford. So you see what I mean here, where I'm getting this nice balance. Very, very clever. In terms of maturation, it had 18 months in oak, and half of that was French new and half of it was French old. So you'll see here there's no American oak. I mentioned at the beginning there was there's a move. It's not necessarily a move away from American, but there's definitely a lean in towards French oak to make a more European style is probably wrong, because this is by no means a European style wine, but definitely a wine with less of that spice and allowing the fruit to show through a little bit more, less of that overt vanilla sweet spice character that can sometimes come through with American. Or alternatively, you get more of the woody spice in French. You can actually get quite a lot of that in American, but let's have a smell. So I do get that woody spice. I said it and immediately I got it. But it's got a really refined, savoury nose. There are still lashings and lashings of berries. I get almost a Ribena smell. It's so concentrated, the fruit. Not the sweetness of the fruit, but just the concentration is so intense. And then I am getting that more earthy, woody, slightly umami smell on the top of it. But all of the savoury is against this very, very intense berry, almost dried berry. God, it's amazing. I get some licorice. I don't often get licorice on a Cabernet, but I'm getting licorice. If anybody else got that, or tell me, am I making it up? I don't know. Yeah, I'm getting licorice. But licorice root, not sort of silly candied sweets. Amazing. So I'm going to have a taste. That is lovely. Now, I think it is pulled back slightly. So a lot of Napa Cabernet can be that rich, indulgent. And I can taste, I'm going to sound like I'm making it up, you can taste the Rutherford because there is that intense berry flavour, but you can taste the mountain side of it. The Mayakama Mountains, that freshness, that kind of energy from not underripe fruit, but perfectly ripe fruit. So it's this really, really lovely marriage. And I also think what's nice is because they went with half new oak and half neutral oak, the tannins have softened slightly, but I'm not being overwhelmed by the taste of oak. There's definitely some there. That sweet spice is present, but there is that savoury spice as well. And then actually it's not too overpowering. It's also 2016, which was actually an early bud break, long growing season. So the temperatures were quite average, but there was some dodgy temperature in the spring in 2016. So the crop has been reduced. So you get good concentration. But it also means that it's 6 years old. So we've got that touch of savoury coming in. It's starting to get developed. And it's kind of got, gorgeous, slight touch of savoury, earthy, wet forest as well. I'm going to quickly, I'm conscious of time. I've overrun. Luckily I've been answering questions as I go, so I won't feel too guilty about spending the last few minutes telling you about the mountain areas of Napa. So let's do the same again. Let's go from south to north quickly. These are a little bit easier, if I'm honest with you, because the mountain regions are probably less well known than the others. Arguably Howell Mountain is well known, but they're less well known. Actually, that's just not true. They are quite well known, but you've probably not heard or seen as many wines. So let's start, where should we start? Let's start on the Vaca side. So we've got Atlas Peak here, very, very structured Cabernet and Chardonnay. So it's the real classics here, but they're really high in acid. So they've got this beautiful longevity and structure. And then Charles Valley, looks like it should be Chiles Valley, but it's not, it's Charles Valley. Here's where you get your Sauvignon Blancs. I mentioned you needed the altitude. They're growing it in the mountains up here. Really good Sauvignon Blanc in Charles Valley. And then also those really refreshing, lighter styles of Zin and Cabernet Sauvignon. So going down that floral violet route. Howell Mountain, which is quite well known, is very, very high up. I can't remember the altitude. Great for Cabernet Sauvignon. It was historically a place for Zinfandel, but Cabernet Sauvignon became so popular that they planted loads of Cabernet, and actually it is very good. So you can't you can't blame them. It's delicious. So then let's do the same again, and let's go from south to north on the Mayacamas, and we've got Mount Verde here, which is really quite this isn't the sea, remember, I should make that clear. This isn't water. The sea is only down here. So it's quite high up, but it's certainly not as cool climate as you might think. And Cabernet and Chardonnay are very popular here. So you are making still quite rich and intense Cabernets and Chardonnays. Spring Mountain District, same again, even though it's mountainous, real intensity, and you're also getting a lot of sunlight. So Cabernet and Chardonnay, again, very popular. And then last but not least, up the top here, we have Diamond Mountain District. And it's the easiest one to remember because it's the home of Schramsberg sparkling. And I think, why on earth, if you were Schramsberg, would you not make more of a thing of diamond and the sparkling wines of Diamond Mountain, which I always think would be quite nice. But Schramsberg, probably the most famous sparkling wine. I think it was the White House sparkling wine for 10 years or something mad, but very, very famous sparkling wine. And it's made here in Diamond Mountain. I mentioned earlier that Calistoga is a bit cooler climate. That peak, that Diamond Mountain, is cooler. So those two that are next to each other get a bit more elevation than the rest. Gosh, I do apologise. I knew I would go on too long. It's because I love Napa wines. I don't get the opportunity to drink them too much because they are expensive. So that's just life. The labour's expensive. I'll quickly tell you why. Labour's expensive, land is expensive, it's limited. You've just seen it's a valley, it's a finite area. You can't make Napa Valley wines over somewhere else. It is the valley of Napa. So it's very hard for me to say they justify the price. It depends what wines you like. You know, if you like Pinot Gris, there's a little bit of Pinot Gris, but not a lot, then you're not shopping in the right place if you want to buy Napa wines for value. But what I would say is for those who like this style of wine, there really isn't anywhere comparable in the whole world. I've got one question in the Q&A. Peter Cousins has been asking about, obviously tonight we're focusing on Napa, but when he used to work in San Francisco a lot, a favorite weekend activity was to drive up to Napa and back down through Sonoma. Geographically, they seem very similar. Is there anything that differentiates Napa from Sonoma wines? I think the climate is going to be your big one here. Sonoma has way more of that San Pablo Bay influence. And I've mentioned Los Caneros, which is a shared AVA between the two, Peter, but actually Sonoma has, when you think about it, if you ever did that drive, it would be just as good to do it the other way around. The reason I say that is Sonoma is home to some more sparkling wines. It's got the lighter styles of the Chardonnay, not lighter as in less interesting. The quality level, I would argue, is the same. But because of that cooling influence, they have a lot more ease growing white wines and Pinot Noir. So they almost have the lighter, cooler grapes.Maybe it was a good idea actually to come back around that way, because I think on the way home doing Napa would have been dangerous. But there are huge similarities, don't get me wrong. I think it's almost a bit of a tragedy that Sonoma wasn't in the Judgement of Paris and therefore didn't have the limelight on it in the same way that Napa did. So Sonoma can often be slightly more affordable, but I do think the quality is there. So I've had another request for Sonoma focus. I say yes. I'm going to get Sarah to make sure we've got some Sonoma wines in stock, and Jonathan, who's our merchandiser, and then 100% I'd love to do one on Sonoma. It's I think the wines are absolutely smashing and they are slightly cooler. A comparison tasting would be fantastic, although if a little hard to organise because it'd be very hard to get a like for like, but consider it done. Mahesh has just said another vote, lots of votes. Okay, so there's loads of Sonoma votes. We'll do a Sonoma event, don't worry about it. And in the future at some point we'll do Sonoma first. Everyone will then have their bases covered, and then at some point it'd be really cool to do a comparison because they are different but have a huge amount of similarities, geologically quite similar in lots of places because of the way the soils were formed around in terms of creation of certain points in the geology, but there are marked differences. So yes, Peter, it sounds like you've hit onto a winner there. Let's do that. So that's it from me. Sorry I ran over, but I was always going to. I enjoy these wines far too much. I hope that for those of you who tried Chaos Theory, or even actually the Cabernet was quite softened with that bottle age, but if you've tried Chaos Theory or and you want to leave it a day, I'd be really keen to hear your thoughts after that. But I would say that these wines are great with food. I'd say the Chardonnay I probably could drink by itself, but certainly try them with food if you can this evening, or if you can over the weekend, or whenever it might be. I think it's they're definitely good wines with a meal. And one thing about visiting the US is you're never far away from a really, really delicious meal with these with these sorts of wines. I've been treated to things like a tacos truck in wineries in California. They just know that wine and food is the best combination. So I'm going to go and enjoy my first press Chardonnay with the fish cakes. Please remember to enjoy the fish cakes. So I'm going to enjoy mine with that. And then I'm going to save these other wines for some rich, hearty dishes over the next few colder months. Enjoy your rest of your evening, members. Thank you, Mahesh, as always, for all your help behind the scenes. Thank you, everyone, for joining me, and watch this space for a Sonoma session. Thank you all.